Many teachers teach that the black horse in chapter 6 of Revelation symbolizes famine, economic hardship, and scarcity, which to a point that is correct. However, the word for word, and actually looking at what the Old Testament or the Tanakh says the symbolism means, we see a different picture. Hello everybody, I'm Keith O'Darren. Welcome to When You Search for the Truth, where we look for the truth by looking at what is actually written in the Word of God, word for word, in the order given from the original text, using the original definitions. Hope you're enjoying this. Let's get started with Revelation chapter 6, verse 5. All right, verse 5 of chapter 6, in the word for word it goes, "When breaking the third seal, heard the third living being say, 'Come into being.' Looking and seeing, a black horse who sat on it had a yoke in his hand." Interesting. If you look up the word here, of that is translated as scales in most Bibles, it is zugos, and zugos means a yoke that is put on to drive cattle, and later became known as a pair of scales, but not during the time that this was written by John in the first century. So if we look at this according to what John and his culture looked at it, we see first a black horse. If we break it down a little bit, we see horse is a symbol of power. Power is given over to this person who is riding the black horse. And black means suffering and mourning, linked to possibly famine, judgment, or spiritual blindness. It kind of opens up a different window to seeing what this means. So what we have here, if we see the breaking of third seal, heard a third living being say, which is again the Word of God, the will of God for the Messiah. He says, come into being, come into reality. And he looked and saw a spiritual blindness, famine, and pain through this power. That's what the black horse is symbolic of. It is, again, sees spiritual blindness, famine, and pain through this power, and who sat on it had a yoke in his hand. A yoke is symbolic of slavery. Now, if you combine the two, what we have here are spiritual blindness created by this power, where these guys have the people of the earth have no idea what's going on because they're spiritually blind. And through this spiritual blindness, they are guided around as this person seems fit. In verse 6, and it says, "In hearing, as if a voice in the center of the four living beings saying, a measure of wheat or grain for a denarius, and 3 measures of barley, a denarius." Then it follows it up with, "No acting unjustly toward the oil and the wine." Most people say this is famine. This is hardship. This is financial hardship, which it may be. It may include financial hardship. Because what we see is a measure of wheat for a denarius and 3 measures of barley for a denarius. When in reality, historically, it was the other way around. So what we see here is an economic system, a hardship, including famine, or I'm sorry, including food, famine, and so on, that has turned the economic system upside down. And then it says, no acting unjustly toward the oil and the wine. And most people teach this. They look at the oil and the wine as something physical. And that's either it's all symbolic or it's not symbolic. Again, this is a literal happening. It's going on. But these things in it are symbolic. So what you're seeing here, it says, no acting unjustly toward the oil and the wine. Interesting to note, oil means anointed, those who are anointed. And the wine, it says, of the covenant. What we're seeing here is this power driving a spiritual blindness, putting people into a type of slavery that they're totally ignoring or oblivious to. And because of it, it's driving the economic system into the ground where it's turned upside down. But yet, no acting unjustly toward the anointed, the Christians and those who have the covenant. Does this mean the Christians and the Jews? Verse 7, when opening the 4th seal, heard a voice of the 4th living being saying, come into being. Again, he's calling it into being. Looking and seeing a greenish brown pale horse, an ashen horse, and who sat on it. Again, pale, ashen means pestilence and famine. So this is where we get our famine, not from the black horse, but from the pale horse, the greenish brown pale horse, the ashen horse. And who sat on it had a name, Death. He was causing death by this, and Hades followed after him. Otherwise, the grave was full of these people being killed off by this famine. And the liberty of doing this as one pleases was given to him over 1/4 of the earth. So otherwise, he's allowed to do anyone he wants. Now keep in mind, in contrast to verse 6, it said, no acting unjustly toward the oil and the wine. Otherwise, don't bother the Christians and the Jews yet. But in verse 8, he's got the liberty to do it to anybody he wants, including the Christians and the Jews. And this is where it starts getting really nasty. And to kill in any way whatsoever with a large sword. Keep in mind, it doesn't say only famine here. It says any way whatsoever with a large sword, otherwise violence. A large sword is representative of violence and killing, and with a scarcity of harvest. That results in famine or deliberately holding things back. And we know later on that no one can buy and sell because of the mark. And with the death of the body and by animals in the earth. Otherwise, he's throwing them in the grave. He's cutting them and letting them lay by layside, and the animals of the earth are consuming these leftovers of these people that he's killing. So we'll continue on with verse 9 and the 5th seal in the next video.